Ma'am, is that a museum piece? The question, laced with the easy arrogance of youth, cut through the tense quiet of the firing line. Corporal Davies, barely 22, with a chiseled jaw and a rifle that looked like it was designed in a science fiction film, nodded toward the young woman's weapon. Raina Caldwell, 37 years old, didn't turn. Her hands, lean, tanned, and steady, remained fixed on the worn wooden stock of her rifle. She lay in the prone position on her canvas mat, her body still, her breathing measured. The only thing that moved was her one open eye, scanning the 1,000 yards of heat-shimmered air to a target that was little more than a speck. In the small set of bleachers behind the firing line, a man sat watching. He was older than the gunny but younger than most retirees, with a ramrod-straight posture that even civilian clothes couldn't hide. This was Elias Vance, a retired master gunnery sergeant and a legend in the competitive shooting world. He hadn't come to watch the hot shots like Davies. He had come because he'd heard a rumor that an old name from the history books was going to be on the line today. He had watched the entire scene unfold, a knot of disgust tightening in his stomach. He saw the polished arrogance of the young Marines, and he saw the quiet, unbreakable dignity of Raina Caldwell. He recognized the rifle model, a customized bolt action from an era not quite past. But more than that, he recognized the look in Raina's eyes. It was the look of someone for whom the rifle was not a tool for sport, but an extension of her will. Vance had seen enough. He pulled out his phone, his thumb moving across the screen with purpose. He didn't call security or the range master. He had a different number in his contacts. He sent a text message to a man he'd served with 20 years ago, a man who was now Colonel Miller, the base's chief of staff. The message was short and direct. "Colonel, get down to range 7 now. There's a living legend on the line being treated like a fool by your new recruits. Her name is Raina Caldwell. You need to handle this personally." Vance put the phone away, his face grim. He knew the name Raina Caldwell would be like a bomb going off in the command building. He settled back to watch. The shot hadn't been fired yet, but the battle for range 7 was already over. The cavalry was on its way. The story of Raina Caldwell's return became an instant legend on the base. The incident was transformed into a mandatory training module for all units, a powerful lesson on heritage, humility, and the quiet valor of the generations that came before. Corporal Davis was indeed reassigned. The arrogance was stripped from him, replaced by a quiet diligence as he learned the stories etched into the brass plaques at the base museum. 1 month later, on a quiet Saturday afternoon, the museum was nearly empty. Davies, now a private first class, was carefully polishing the glass of an Iraq War exhibit. The door creaked open, and Raina Caldwell walked in, wearing a simple polo shirt and jeans. Davies stiffened, his heart pounding. He expected a rebuke, a final word of condemnation. But Raina just smiled, a kindly smile, and walked over to the display case. "This is a good place," Raina said, her voice soft. "Lots of stories here." She pointed to a battle-worn rifle inside the case, a model identical to her own. Had one just like it. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, two Marines from different worlds connected by the long, unbroken line of the Corps. Davies finally found his voice. "Ma'am," he said, turning to face her. His eyes were clear, his shame replaced by hard-won respect. Raina Caldwell looked at the young Marine, truly looked at him, and clapped him firmly on the shoulder. "You're learning, son," she said. "That's all any of us can ever do. Keep learning." Raina turned and walked out, leaving the young man alone with the ghosts and the legends. Davies watched her go, then turned back to the glass. In his reflection, he no longer saw an arrogant hotshot. He saw a Marine who was finally beginning to understand the profound weight and honor of the uniform he wore. The heroes who walk among us often carry the heaviest stories with the quietest grace. If you were moved by Raina Caldwell's story of valor, show your support by liking this video, sharing it with a friend, and subscribing to Veterans Past Stories for more tales of courage and respect. The scope wasn't just a piece of glass and metal. It was the last thing a sister had ever touched. It was a promise. "A steady hand and a clear eye don't come from a factory," Raina said, tapping her chest. "They come from here." She tapped her temple. "And from here, it's the marksman, not the rifle." The general, moved by her words, simply nodded. He turned to the stunned range officer. "Gunny, clear the firing line. Everyone off, except for Miss Caldwell." The range was cleared in record time. The crowd of Marines, including a humbled and ashamed Davies, stood back in a silent, reverent semicircle. The general looked at Raina. "Ma'am," he said softly, "the line is yours." Raina gave another slow nod. She walked back to her mat and settled into position as if she were alone. She didn't check the wind again. She didn't readjust her scope. She became one with the rifle, a seamless fusion of woman and machine. She breathed in, she breathed out. The rifle cracked, a single sharp report that echoed across the silent valley. For a long moment, nothing happened. Everyone held their breath, eyes fixed on the large digital monitor that displayed the target results. Then a number flashed on the screen. A perfect 10, a dead center bullseye. But it was more than that. The computer system measuring the shot's position to 1,000th of an inch registered a grouping so precise it was almost a mathematical impossibility. The old record set by a younger Raina Caldwell 17 years ago flashed on the screen, and then beside it the new score appeared. She had broken her own unbreakable record. The silence broke. It wasn't polite applause. It was a roar, a deep, thunderous ovation of pure, unadulterated respect from hundreds of United States Marines for one of their own. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You mocked her rifle. That rifle has seen more combat than your entire company combined. You mocked her equipment. That equipment was trusted in battles you can't even imagine, fighting for the very freedom that gives you the right to wear that uniform." He paused. "You are relieved of your duties. You will report to the base sergeant major. Your new duty station is the base museum. You will spend every day for the next month cleaning the displays, and you will learn the story behind every weapon, every uniform, and every hero in that building. Is that understood?" "Yes, General," Davies choked out, his face white as a sheet. Raina Caldwell finally spoke. She stepped forward and placed a gentle hand on the general's starched sleeve. "General," she said, her voice calm. "He's young. We were all young once, full of fire, eager to prove we belong." She turned her gaze to Davies, and there was no malice in it, only a deep, weary wisdom. "Son," she said, "this rifle, this scope, they aren't about the technology, it's about respect. Respect for your equipment, respect for your brothers and sisters in arms, and most of all, respect for yourself." Her hand rested on the scope, and another memory, sharp and clear, surfaced. A dusty compound, the air thick with smoke and fear. Her spotter, Carmen, a fierce kid from Texas, who always had a joke ready. An enemy sniper had them pinned. Carmen used a helmet on a stick as a decoy. A shot rang out. The helmet flew. Carmen grinned. "Got him!" A split second later, another shot. A ricochet from a brick wall whipped past Raina's head and struck the scope of her rifle with a violent crack. The impact spun the rifle, saving her eye, maybe her life. Carmen, ever resourceful, pulled a tube of epoxy from her pack. "A good luck scar," she'd said as she patched the deep gouge in the metal. The next day, Carmen was gone, a victim of an IED strike. He paused, letting the hallowed unit designation hang in the air. She fought at Fallujah, at Marja, at Helmand Province, at places whose names are now etched into the walls of our chapels. His voice grew more intense. She was awarded the Navy Cross for gallantry in action. He paused. And then she was awarded a second Navy Cross for gallantry in action. The colonel took a breath. And for her actions at Combat Outpost Keating, where she single-handedly held off an enemy assault force for 14 hours, armed with little more than the rifle she holds in her hands today, she was awarded the Medal of Honor. A collective gasp went through the crowd. The smirks and whispers were gone, replaced by a wave of shock and profound, humbling awe. The young Marines looked at Raina not as a woman out of place, but as a titan from their history books come to life. "And one more thing," Colonel Miller added, his eyes finding Davies's. "In 2008, at this very range, then Corporal Caldwell used that same rifle and that same museum piece scope to set the 1,000-yard single-shot course record. He let that sink in, a record which, for 17 years, every Marine on this base, including you, Corporal, has tried and failed to break." The general finally lowered his salute and turned his glacial gaze upon Davies. His voice was not loud, but it was heavy, each word a hammer blow. "Corporal, this corps is a house. It is a house built on the sacrifice of people like her. You are a guest in that house. You do not mock the architects. A general didn't just drop by a firing range. An arrival like this meant one of two things, a catastrophe or the second coming." The gunnery sergeant, his face now pale, fumbled for his whistle and blew a sharp, piercing blast. "Cease fire! Cease fire! Unload and show clear," he bellowed, his voice cracking with nervousness. The general ignored everyone. He strode past the slack-jawed Corporal Davies as if he were a piece of furniture. He walked past the gunnery sergeant. His eyes, like chips of blue ice, were locked on one person, the young woman in the faded shooting jacket, who was now slowly and a little stiffly pushing herself up from the ground. The general stopped 3 feet in front of Raina Caldwell. He stood for a moment, his gaze taking in the young woman and the ancient rifle she held. Then, in a movement so sharp and precise it seemed to cut the air, he snapped the most immaculate salute of his long and distinguished career. His hand didn't waver, his posture was perfect. Miss Caldwell, the general's voice boomed, carrying across the silent range with the full force of his command. "It is an honor to have you on our range, ma'am." Raina looked at the general, a flicker of surprise in her dark eyes, and gave a slow, simple nod of acknowledgement. Colonel Miller stepped forward, holding a digital tablet. "Corporal Davies," he barked. Davies, who looked as if he might faint, jolted to attention. "You and your fire team, you will stand at attention until I tell you otherwise." They scrambled to comply, their faces a mixture of terror and utter confusion. The colonel looked down at his tablet, then back at the assembled Marines. "For the education of those who have forgotten the meaning of respect," he began, his voice cold and clear, "let me tell you who you are standing in the presence of." He paused, letting the weight settle. Raina Caldwell, enlisted in the United States Marine Corps, 2009. Service, Republic of Iraq and Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. 1st Marine Division, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. It was a stunning breach of etiquette, a direct and insulting taunt during a live fire event. The gunnery sergeant spun around, his face turning a dark shade of red. "Davies, mind your lane. That's your final warning." But Raina didn't seem to hear them. The world had shrunk to the small circle of light at the end of her vintage scope. The glass was old, but it was pristine German crystal, clearer and brighter than any of the mass-produced lenses in the modern scopes. She saw the target not as a piece of paper, but as a problem to be solved. She felt the subtle shift of the wind against her cheek, calculated the drop, and let her breathing slow until the world seemed to slow with it. Her finger rested on the trigger. It was then that a new sound began to intrude, a low rumble from behind them that grew steadily louder. It wasn't thunder. It was the sound of powerful engines moving at speed. Heads began to turn. Down the long gravel access road, a procession of black command vehicles and military police cars was approaching, kicking up a rooster tail of dust. They didn't slow for the parking area. They drove right onto the grass behind the firing line, coming to a halt in a perfectly spaced, intimidating line. Their red and blue lights flashed in the bright sun, but their sirens remained silent, which was somehow more menacing. Doors opened in perfect disciplined unison. Out stepped the base commander himself, a 2-star general, his uniform immaculate, his face a mask of grim purpose. He was followed by Colonel Miller and a phalanx of sergeants major, the highest-ranking enlisted personnel on the base. The effect was instantaneous. The shooting stopped. The chatter died. The entire range, filled with some of the deadliest marksmen in the world, fell into a stunned, absolute silence. Project Hawkeye 2, lead marksman. Efficacy rating 100%. Miller felt a chill creep up his spine. Project Hawkeye 2 was a Black Ops sniper program from Iraq and Afghanistan, a continuation of the legendary Vietnam-era initiative so secret it was officially denied to have ever existed. And this woman was its lead operator. "Get the base commander on the line," Miller snapped, his voice tight with adrenaline. "Tell him it's a Code Alpha heritage issue. Then get me a car and a security detail. We are going to Range 7, and we are going fast." Back on the sun-baked firing line, the command was given, "Shooters, you may commence firing when your target is ready." A series of sharp cracks echoed down the line as the other Marines began their strings of fire. Corporal Davis, eager to put on a show, sent 5 rounds downrange in quick succession. The electronic monitor above his lane showed a tight, respectable grouping in the center ring. He racked his bolt and glanced over at Raina's lane with a smug grin. She hadn't even fired yet. She was still lying there, perfectly still, as if she were part of the landscape. "Hey, sweetheart, you going to shoot that thing, or just take a nap?" Davis called out, his voice loud and clear over the intermittent gunfire. "Better hurry before the wind changes or before you break a nail." Inside the climate-controlled quiet of the base command center, Colonel Miller glanced at his phone, his brow furrowing in annoyance at the interruption. The all-Marine competition was running smoothly, and he was busy coordinating with VIPs in attendance. But the text was from Elias Vance, and Vance wasn't one for drama. He read the message twice. "Raina Caldwell," he mumbled to himself. The name was familiar, a whisper from the deep history of the Corps, but he couldn't place it. He turned to his aide, a sharp-eyed captain standing nearby. "Captain, do me a favor. Run the name Raina Caldwell through the service records database. Cross-reference with today's competitor roster for the rifle competition." "Aye, sir," the captain said, turning to his terminal. He typed in the name. For a moment, he stared at the screen, his fingers frozen over the keyboard. Then his eyes widened. He shot to his feet so fast his chair screeched back and nearly tipped over. "Sir," he said, his voice an urgent, strangled whisper, "you need to see this." Colonel Miller walked over, an impatient look on his face. He looked at the screen, and the blood drained from his face. It wasn't a standard service record. It was a ghost file, a heavily redacted document that was more black ink than text. There was a single grainy photo from the mid-2000s, showing a young woman with old eyes and a face as hard as iron. The file listed decorations that were the stuff of Marine Corps mythology, a Navy Cross, then another, and then at the top a citation for the Medal of Honor, the details of which were classified at a level the colonel himself couldn't access. Beneath it, a single cryptic entry. The smell of fresh-cut grass and gunpowder was replaced by the thick metallic scent of blood and burning fuel. The pop-pop-pop of distant rifles became the deafening roar of automatic fire and the gut-wrenching whine of incoming rounds. She was 24 years old again, her cheek pressed against this same stock, her knuckles white as she gripped this same rifle. The scratch wasn't there yet. A voice young, fierce, and full of life shouted over the chaos. It was her spotter, Carmen. "Keep her steady, Ray. Make it count." The memory vanished as quickly as it came, a flash of lightning in her mind, but it left a stillness in its wake, a cold, hard focus that burned away the noise of the laughing Marines and the gunny's warning. The scratch wasn't damage. It was a scar, a reminder. She settled back into her prone position, the familiar weight of the rifle a comfort. The humiliation was a physical presence now, a heavy blanket over the entire range. The young Marines were no longer whispering. They were openly making bets, their voices confident. $10 says she won't even hit the paper. 20 says the old scope falls off after the first shot. Davies, feeling vindicated, just shook his head with theatrical pity. Honestly, someone should have stopped her before she embarrassed herself like this. The comments were like stones skipped across a calm pond, each one making a wider ripple. Other competitors, younger men and women in their prime, began to notice. They saw the cluster of laughing Marines and the young woman they were targeting. A few looked uncomfortable, but no one intervened. Davies was a known hotshot, a top shooter from his unit, and his confidence was infectious. The crowd's silent consensus seemed to be that the woman was out of her depth, a well-meaning amateur who'd wandered into the wrong competition. Feeling empowered by the audience, Davies decided to escalate. This wasn't just fun anymore. It was about standards. This woman and her ancient gear were a potential safety hazard and honestly, kind of an insult to everyone who'd trained hard to be here. He stood up and strode over to the range safety officer, a gunnery sergeant with a face like granite and the patience of a ticking clock. "Gunny, I've got a concern," Davies said, projecting his voice for effect. He pointed back at Raina. "That competitor's equipment. It doesn't look regulation. Frankly, it doesn't look safe. I'm worried about a misfire, or worse." The entire firing line went quiet. A direct challenge to another competitor's gear was a serious move. The gunnery sergeant's eyes narrowed. He was bound by protocol to investigate any safety concern. With a heavy sigh, he walked down the line, his boots crunching on gravel, every step echoing in the sudden silence. He stopped beside Raina's mat. "Ma'am," the gunny said, his voice professional but firm, "I've received a complaint about your weapon system. I need to inspect it." Raina slowly, deliberately pushed herself up to a sitting position. She didn't look angry or embarrassed. She simply looked composed, as if this was an interruption she'd weathered 1,000 times before. She picked up the rifle and handed it to the gunnery sergeant. The gunny took the weapon. He worked the bolt. It moved with a smoothness that only comes from decades of meticulous care. He checked the chamber, the barrel, the trigger assembly. It was old. Yes, the bluing was worn to a silver sheen in places and the wood was dark with age and oil, but it was flawlessly maintained. He then examined the scope, squinting at the old glass. "She's sighted in, gunny," Raina said, her voice a low, steady calm. "She'll do the job." The gunnery sergeant could find no legitimate safety violation. The rifle was sound, but the pressure from Davies and the expectant eyes of the other Marines weighed on him. "The rifle checks out," he announced to the line, "but it is a non-standard piece of equipment. Ma'am, you can proceed, but be advised, any operational failure, any issue at all, and you will be immediately disqualified from the competition." He handed the rifle back. As Raina took it, her thumb brushed over a deep, jagged scratch in the metal housing of the scope just beside the windage adjustment knob. For a fraction of a second, the bright, sun-drenched range dissolved. Davies smirked at his squad mates, who chuckled behind their hands. "License and registration on that thing, ma'am." Another one whispered, "Just loud enough to carry. Better check if it's coded as a historical artifact." Their own rifles were marvels of modern engineering, black polymer covered in rails and attachments, with scopes the size of small telescopes. Reina's rifle was a relic of wood and blued steel. And the scope was the real joke. It was slender with brass fittings and visible scratches on its housing. Compared to their high-powered optics, it looked like a toy from a vintage shop. The mockery, which had started as murmurs when Reina first uncased her weapon, now grew bolder. They were a pack, young and strong, clad in the crisp digital camouflage of the modern Marine Corps. They saw a young woman who seemed out of place, someone who looked like she belonged at a yoga retreat, not on a firing line. This was the all-Marine rifle competition, a showcase of the best marksmen in the Corps. To them, Reina was an embarrassment, a harmless but misguided civilian playing dress-up in their high-stakes world of precision shooting. "Look at the finish on that stock," Davy said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Bet she got it at some antique store. Probably thinks it makes her look authentic." "That scope's probably got more dust inside than glass," his friend, a private named Miller, added. "Can she even see the target from here? Maybe someone should check if she needs prescription lenses."